Thank you all for joining us. This is a really fun event, and I hope you think so too, those of you who are here for the first time. We have two kind of named awards here. One is the Farley Writing Awards, and we're going to start out with that. And I'm going to turn the mic over to John Tempte, who has won a writing award. We can't remember exactly, but 7 or 8 times in the past. Not this year, so I could ask him to do it in lieu of John Frey. So John Frey is not here because he's at his class reunion. I didn't ask John how many years, but it's his undergraduate, it's his Notre Dame group that are getting together for their reunion. So we'll give John the bye, and John can take over.
Well, thank you so much, Val. I have very big shoes to fill tonight, so I hope I'll do it justice. John Frey has just been such a wonderful contributor to our department, and particularly in terms of the writing awards. I'll just read through that you have in your program. Created in 2010, these awards recognize outstanding contributions of creative writing in any genre by DFMCH faculty, staff, residents, and medical students, and in the Family Medicine Interest Group. Includes but not limited to editorials, essays, short stories, commentaries, poetry, and narratives. The DFMCH Awards Committee reviews entries each year and selects the award recipients anonymously. Stories are wonderful things. I think if I toss out a fox standing underneath a grape tree talking about sour grapes, we can all relate to that. You toss out a child thrown into a den with lions. That takes me back to my childhood. Stories are really, really important. They're the things that we lay awake at night with our lights on, read. The last story I finished was on a flight back very late at night, this past Wednesday night from Atlanta. Finished Lincoln in the Bardo, so if you're looking for a good book. And the story behind that, I have to just say, where did I buy that book? Some of you know L.J. Fagnan, faculty in Oregon, and he introduced me to this wonderful bookstore in Washington, D.C. It's Kramer Books and Afterwards Cafe on DuPont Circle. And every time I go to D.C., that's my one place I have to go. And so this last time, I was there mid-August, stopped by and bought a book of Wendell Berry poems and Lincoln in the Bardo. So just wonderful stories. Tim O'Brien is a author from Minnesota, and wrote a wonderful book called The Things They Carried. But through this collection of short stories, he has a number of wonderful quotes about stories. But this too is true. Stories can save us. Stories are for joining the past to the future. Stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for eternity, when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story. And then in a story, which is kind of a dreaming, the dead sometimes smile and sit up and return to the world. So we have some wonderful stories here. I look at the narratives, the prose, the stories, and the poetry all as stories. And I'd like to start out by asking Ildi Mortanfi to come up for her dress code. I'm not going to be thinking about anything, Ildi, when you come up, okay?
You're not going to be thinking about anything?
I'm just going off of your first couple of lines there.
Okay.
And if we have time, if you would be willing to either read the whole or just a selection,
Okay.
that would be wonderful.
All right, this is brief. I decided I wouldn't apologize for the naughty, not so nice word in this poem. I I will apologize if at some point I have to leave to run back to St. Mary's because I'm attending on inpatient. And there are many ways I could introduce this poem. I will just choose to say it was in some ways inspired by Maria von Trapp from The Sound of Music. So it's entitled Dress Code. If you are a woman, every goddamn XY has an opinion about your ass. From the middle-aged drunk man on the bus who shouts to your freshman 15 self, "Come off it, girl, them jeans is too tight," to the dress code that says, "Don't you dare show your ass in jeans unless it's a Packers game and the football gods have blessed it. Those legs better be covered too, no naked flesh for you. The legs that hold up the heart that has borne witness to so much pain and suffering of others. The legs that crouch down to auscultate the teddy bear. The legs that could walk the hospital hallways without a body attached. They know them so well. In your shoes, you'd better run to save a life. But don't make too much noise on your way there."
What?
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thanks, Don. Thanks for the
So next up, and I have a quick question, because I remember a faculty meeting at Wingra when we talked about dress code. I don't know if that had anything to do with this.
I had strong feelings about certain aspects of it. Those have mostly been remedied.
Okay. The next poem is Jennifer Edgoose. If Jennifer can come up here. And this is on Tottenham Beacon, summer 2018. And I have to confess, after I read this, I went on Google and I Googled the image of Tottenham Beacon, which I couldn't find, but I'm assuming there's some high hills from which signal fires. I'm thinking Lord of the Rings, the last one where the signal fires go across. So this is on Tottenham Beacon, summer 2018.
Thank you. This is almost a little too close to home. This is about my father-in-law, who's actually actively dying as I talk to you right now. So I had the privilege of spending a couple weeks with him in late June and getting him home from a nursing home. And so there are these amazing hills within miles of my in-laws' home in England. They live in Bedfordshire. And there are these old, Roman hill forts there, and there are these hills. And actually, Tottenham Beacon is a site that's within miles of their home, and they'd actually never visited it. And somehow, my daughter Maya thought, oh, we should go there for a walk, after spending lots of time in a not very inspiring nursing facility. So we took my mother-in-law there. So I'll just read it. A world getting hotter, sparks flying and fires rage, dying in climate-conscious Japan, burning beside a Greek sea, the irony, humorless, smoldering, tempers flaring, an age of anxiety. On this day, John can no longer walk, and Rosemary forgets to remember. The heartlessness of time, a mean nursing home. And so as the scorching sun sets, we climb to find relief, a yellowing hill in England's green and pleasant lands, a hill where long ago fires once flickered, not raged, spreading news from London to Ivinghoe, to Tottenham and beyond, perhaps of death, but also of birth, a new king, a new queen. Now outside the sun's blistering gaze, the shadows lengthen, and we see the wildflowers at our feet, a posy to be had. The stars wink next to a shy, waning moon. Somewhere hedgehogs stir in the hedgerows. The evening breeze cools our brows. We exhale to breathe anew. Thank you.
The image was very, very green.
Right. It was yellow this summer.
Congratulations. Maggie Larson is not here tonight, but her poem, The Shell, is also an award winner and talks about the shell, to some extent, of the electronic medical record. And there are images of the challenges and sometimes the burnout of medical practice these days and that. So I encourage everybody to take a look at that. And then I'm going to finish up and just say very quickly that I do try Cassie, but I'm not reliable, okay? Cass Sundaram is in our department and is a research coordinator with Wren and has the pros, explanations for eating hot soup outside on a hot day. And I'm going to ask you to come up here and read a couple of your favorite ones. All right.
I don't know about anyone else, but it seems like it's getting harder and harder to find explanations for what's going on in the world right now. So that's sort of what I thought about when I was eating hot soup outside on a hot day. And I thought, if someone were to see me right now, they'd probably ask, why am I doing this? And I was like, well, I'm not really in control of anything else in the world. So if I feel like eating hot soup, I'll probably just go ahead and do that. Okay. I ate hot soup on a hot day because Paul from Toyota called to tell me that my brakes were dead and a rear brake overhaul cost $600. I ate hot soup on a hot day because I love that Camry, even though it's 18 years old and is probably voting right now for its own retirement. I ate hot soup on a hot day because I pulled out a gray hair only to discover that it was actually still 80% brown. I ate hot soup on a hot day because they say people my age are getting anxiety at increasing rates, and I can't say I disagree. I ate hot soup on a hot day while a president tweeted nonsense, the internet feigned outrage, and kids had to march to prove their lives are worth more than a weapon that some people use to kill other people. I ate hot soup on a hot day because I recalled how one winter night I spent 2.5 hours carefully crafting a typewritten letter to John Mayer because of a contest on Instagram. And he never wrote back, even though he said he would, even though he said he would respond to the first 100, and there's no way that I was not in the top 100. I ate hot soup on a hot day because the John Mayer fiasco made me come to the conclusion that boys try, but in the end, they're just not super reliable. I ate hot soup on a hot day because these days it seems like reasonable people can disagree on complex issues, but we never really seem to be able to talk about our disagreements very well. I ate hot soup on a hot day because I guess I thought I'd feel more security than I did last year, but I don't. I ate hot soup on a hot day because I might not be in control of anything else, but at least I can choose whether to eat soup or not. So I'll keep eating soup at any time of the year if I feel like it.
And back to you, Val.
Thanks, John. If you haven't found it yet, you know the ID reports that John and his group put out on a regular basis, which are really fun to read and tell you about the respiratory illnesses. Also, if you keep on going and you keep reading and reading and reading and reading, you get to the nugget that John has put in. Sometimes it's a link to a piece of music. Sometimes it's a bit of biology describing a bird that I'd never heard of. And sometimes it's a poem. The poems I've taken to collecting, John. They are absolutely wonderful. So read the report, but also keep on going and you'll find that joyful little nugget. I also, before we switch to our invited speaker, I would like to say some thank yous. Where's Sue McGuire? Is she still around the corner? Right here. I heard that right here. So I really want to thank Sue again for all that she's done the arranging this morning and all of these arrangements here, which she does so capably. And the flyers, she does all our flyers. She has the most amazing eye for layout. I also want to thank Armando, who's taken pictures for us for years and is our photo record keeper. And we wouldn't be the same without you, Armando. Thank you. I was talking earlier to our speaker, Dr. Renee Critchlow, and it has been even better than I thought it'd be having her here. The meeting this morning was provocative, thoughtful, reflective, and yet enough passion that most of us, I think, could inspire to change a little, to change our thinking, of course, which is the hardest. I walked in on a noontime seminar that she was talking to a bunch of residents and Ildi and some others, and boy, I liked what I heard. And again, interesting conversation. And I'm sure we're going to get to hear some more. As she and I were talking, we were reflecting on Linda and Jean Farley. She has the Farley Professorship, and that's why Renee is here. For those of you who met Jean and Linda, I don't need to say anymore, because you know what they brought to our department and to the discipline. For those of you who haven't, they were activists, physicians, caring teachers, mentors, to literally hundreds, if not thousands, of family physicians. I knew Jean and Linda long before I came here, 30 years ago, and was impressed with them then, and when I got to work with them, even more so, even though they were retired or retiring at the time. Their legacy is what Renee is bringing to us tonight. How to be a passionate advocate and do our bit in transforming the world. From her education at UC Davis to San Francisco to a policy fellowship in DC to rural practice in Montana. And since 2009 has been in Minnesota, at the University of Minnesota, as their Director of Advocacy and Policy, and also at North Memorial Family Medicine Program, which she talked about earlier, serves one of the very underserved or challenged areas in the city. You'll enjoy your talk. Thank you for coming and being with us, Renee.
I'm on, great. And thank you for that wonderful salute, whatever that was. And thank you very much, Dr. Gilchrist. This is my, I think, second time. Now I remember why I was in Madison. There was an SNMA regional conference a few years ago. And because I was just kind of talking with Val, I was like, yeah, I've been here before, but I'm not 100% sure why. And then I thought to myself, that must strike just the most amazing kind of confidence into that woman. So I really wanted to be very clear about how incredibly humbled and honored I am to receive this. One of the things that happens is you get this email and they say, oh, we want you to do a visiting professorship. And the first thing you're like, CV, check, all right, gonna do that. And I'm like, what is this about? And then I kept running into people who knew the Farleys, from students to faculty, and the impact that they clearly had on people's lives was pronounced. And so every day the honor became more great and I became more humble about it. This is amazing. There's amazing people. One of the things that I got to do was sort of dive into some of the readings and writings that were done about them. And one of the things I really liked about what Jean said, I was not one who felt we should change the name of general practice to family practice, because I was a proud general practitioner. However, I felt that once we changed the name, that we'd better change the educational programs to do what's needed. I think the unit of care is the patient, but I can do that as a pediatrician. I can do that as an internist or an obstetrician or something else. The context that the patient lives also is something that I have to respond to. The context in which the patient lives is also something I have to respond to. Because I care for people of all ages, I realize I care for families. And he goes on to say, by the seat of my pants, I had to learn that. Nobody ever taught me. And so what I really enjoy about the Farleys is things are multi-directional with them. The patients are the center. The communities that they work in are the context that they feel very responsible for. But then they're also laying the groundwork for the future. This is what we need to do to move this forward. Not only am I taking good care of the patient I have right in front of me, what is my responsibility to my learners in my society? And one of my favorite things that I found out, they talked about how basically one of Jean's mantras was, healthcare is a right and not a privilege. And I think that that is one of the things we are arguing about right now. There are some of us who feel very strongly that this is exactly how we need to approach healthcare, because this is not something we should monetize. This is something that we should hold sacred. So, usually I do this at the end of a presentation, but these people really struck me a great deal. And so I hate to do it. I'm going to read a poem. And when I say hate to do it, I don't hate to do it. I love reading poems. So this is called The Way It Is, and it's by William Stafford. When I read this, I see the people who we're trying to appreciate and celebrate here, because I feel like this is one of the ways they live their lives. It's called The Way It Is. There's a thread you follow. It goes among the things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. Don't ever let go of the thread. When I look at the lives that these two amazing individuals have led, I see them as someone who held deeply onto that thread, and they're very good examples of why we should do it. Looking at their website, this was what struck me the most. It was right on the header. Without justice, there can be no peace. Without peace, there can be no sustainability. And without sustainability, there can be no future. These are people that are constantly addressing challenges at every possible level. And it really flows well with what we chose to talk about today. So targeted social justice, evidence for advocacy addressing ACEs. I'm not a big fan of objectives because I'm like, I know what I want to say. But they always make you put it up there. So basically the objectives that we're looking for is a conversation on what actions can be taken to mitigate and prevent health inequities. And the lens we're bringing it through is adverse childhood events, ACEs. One of the other big parts of this is talking about advocacy. What is advocacy, and what does that mean to people? A lot of times when people hear the word advocacy, what they think of is generally someone else. Anybody? Like those guys over there are doing that thing. A lot of times it has something to do with the legal system. A lot of times it has something to do with politics. Basically, I'm a big fan of whenever I teach, I do two big things I always tell those folks. I teach from fear, because people stay focused. And I like etymologies. I'm like, oh, where did that word come from? So advocate, from the Latin advocatus. And if I'm telling you something you already know, just let everyone else catch up. It's okay. one called to aid another, a pleader on one's behalf. Summoned, call to aid, from ad, which is to, and vocer, to call. So when I think about that, it helps me sort of get an idea of what it is I'm actually thinking that this entity does. I'm summoned to aid someone else. It's a call that I'm trying to answer. This is someone who needs help, and I'm here to aid them. You can advocate for yourself. And one of the things we talked about was advocating for family medicine, and that advocating for your patients is actually strongly advocating for family medicine. So, and this is meant always to be as much as a conversation as possible, which is why I made really tiny font. Because if it's tiny, you don't have to spend a lot of time on it. Basically, we're going to do the little hand. Oh, you should always check this. If you're ever a family medicine physician and you're lecturing to or presenting to a crowd, always just sort of say, hey, just checking, is there any world experts on this in the room? Anybody? Okay, good. Because I remember doing a cardiac valve talk, and he's like, well, I actually did that surgery. I designed that. And I'm like, oh, super. Why don't you just finish this up? So, but ACE is something that a lot of us have heard about. It's come up a lot more lately because we're dealing with trying to address health inequities. And it was very curious to me that it's really in that situation of correlation, not necessarily causation. And that's one of the things we have to sort of look at. It's like, what are these events in someone's life correlate with? Honestly, a lot of it is a chaotic life. A lot of it is challenges of a dysfunctional family. A lot of it is challenges of an isolated family. These issues, these adverse events don't come up in isolation. They're just, and they break them down into 3 different areas. You have abuse, which is basically emotional abuse, physical abuse, or sexual abuse. As Dr. Gilchrist mentioned, I used to work in Montana. One of my positions in our residency program was I was the director of the state women's prisons. I was medical director of the state women's prison, which was literally like down the street from our FQHC. And if we had the ability to eliminate childhood sexual abuse, that prison would have been empty. There was not one prisoner patient that I had that had not been abused as a child. Not one. They would talk, we'll get a little more cheery later. But I had a patient, she's like, yeah, I get really depressed, I use drugs, but I just don't want to remember that time when my brother raped me in the cemetery. I was like, there's so many wrong layers there. And she responded to that by hiding in chemicals. And you know what? That was completely reasonable. If we could have eliminated sexual abuse, that prison would have been empty. I would have had to find another job, but I was good with that. Household challenges. The dysfunctions that manifest in many different ways. People using street drugs, mental illness, someone in the house having a criminal history, engagement with either jail or prison, physical violence perpetrated on another person, not necessarily yourself. That as a manifestation of the chaos this patient, soon-to-be patient, is dealing with. And it's very interesting because if we look at a lot of these issues that come up, one of the things that we talked about today is that there's a disproportional representation in underrepresented minorities and people of color. And if you look at the criminal household member, if you live in an over-policed neighborhood, the things you do that we always use Edina in Minnesota. Edina, what's your fancy suburb? You got one, what is it? There you go. So we're like, Edina's our Shownook. So we're like, if I tell my patients, mom will bring him in, she's like, he's doing drugs. I'm like, okay, she's like, test him. I was like, why don't we just ask him? I was like, are you using drugs? He was like, I smoke some marijuana. And we live in North Minneapolis, and it's 80% low wealth African American, about 20% immigrant population. And I will be very clear with these young men. I say, listen, if you're the white guy in Edina and you get caught smoking a joint, you're just going to get a handshake and a warning. This happens to you, you're going to jail. And it's going to ruin your life. It's going to ruin your mother's life. And your little brother, who's going to see you and grow up in a household, it's going to make their health worse. And I was like, is that fair? And they're like, that's not fair. I'm like, yeah, it's not fair. And what we're looking at is, when we talk about justice, the bottom line on justice is fairness. And a lot of these challenges that people are addressing directly happen because we have an unfair, unjust society. And it affects the health of the children, it affects the health when they're older, and it affects the health of the subsequent generations. So, fix that. So neglect. I think neglect is probably the saddest one because you ever see that kid? You just like, this kid's a genius. They just sort of, everyone else in the family is like running around the exam room, and that kid's like maybe on the phone or reading or something, just totally calm, and the entire world's swirling around them. And mom is not paying any attention to them. And they know that they're not going to get any attention. And when it's their turn in the well child visit, do you guys still have the 4 children well child visits? Oh dear God, that's like, you got to play zone. But yeah, you see that kid, and some of the other kids might have either some mental issues or developmental issues or behavioral issues, and that kid is quiet and often very precocious, taking care of some of the younger kids. But no one's paying attention to them. And when they get older and they say things like, well, no one paid attention to me when I was little, the person who got the crap beat out of them, they're like, well, you're lucky because someone paid attention to me and it sucked. But it has the same level of effect. It produces a stress adaptive response because you're not cared for. The physical neglect, one of the manifestations that you'll see is kids that, like, I love school uniforms. When I was growing up, it was in the 70s and 80s. It's not that long ago. And I remember they were talking about getting school uniforms, and I was like, that's awesome. My parents were going through a divorce, everything was messy, and the best thing would have been if I just had to throw on a polo and some khakis every day. If they threw in a tie, I'd be like, yeah. But there were all those kids that were like, I don't feel I can express my individuality. And I was like, I just don't want to have to choose because I don't have that much clothes. And the idea that there's kids that they get to go to school more often now because schools have put in washers and dryers. Because the kid doesn't want to show up in stinky clothes, and he can't get it done at home. So, innovative approaches can be very helpful, because absenteeism contributes to long-term poor health too, and can lead to just entering that little school-to-prison pipeline that we all love so much. So, neglect, the quiet killer. So, NPR. We have to be very aggressive in Minnesota when we say NPR because our local one is MPR. And people will just get all over it. N or M, and you're like, N. It's on the same frequency. I'm not sure whether that's important to you. This is one of their infographics, and I think they do a really good job of sort of putting it out there. And these are, when you look at it, it's like these are not inconsequential things, but they're also not uncommon things. But what they also tend to do is cluster. Folks that have one can more likely have more than one. And folks that have more than one very often have a whole lot more than one. And as we'll note, this is CDC did this. And I really like this ACE pyramid because what it talks about, the whole concept is that the adverse childhood experiences are the sort of foundation of what happens. and then it interrupts disrupts neurodevelopment, which disrupts your prosocial training and behaviors, which leads to high-risk health behaviors, disease, disability, blah, 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 and then you die. Earlier. We all die. Unless you know something I don't. Okay. Yeah. So when you're looking at this pyramid, keep this in mind. We're going to bring this back. As we were saying before, this is a dose-dependent occurrence. The more ACEs you have, the more likely the bad things are going to happen to you. And it starts like quadrupling its effect on your long-term health. So once you hit 4, you're in a world of hurt. Has anyone taken the ACEs test? Yeah, so it is a dose response. And you don't have to get in too deep, but basically, if you have 4 more childhood exposures, you're seeing 4 to 12 increase in health risks: alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, suicide, 2 to 4-fold increase in smoking, poor self-health rating, greater than or equal to 50 sexual partners, STIs, and increase in physical activity and severe obesity. And then they talk about also chronic illnesses. And this is all, it's a dose response. The more that you have, the more likely that you'll go this direction. So, and these are some of the adverse: alcoholism, alcohol abuse, chronic COPD, depression, fetal death, liver disease, financial stress, poor academic. And so you look at this, and someone that has these things occurring in their life, what are the likelihood that they'll have a nice, functional family? These occurrences produce situations that perpetuate intergenerationally. And that's where it gets very insidious. I remember taking the NPR quiz. And honestly, after I took it, I was like, I should be either dead or very drunk right now. I was neither. Still the case. But these are all the sequelae that they talk about. And the more that you've had those adverse childhood events, the more likely that you're going to have some of these responses. So, when we talk about engaging with these responses, what we have to think about is, A, if it's already happened, what can we do to mitigate it? And if it hasn't already happened, what can we do to prevent it? So those are the big areas that we're looking at. It's almost like, we've had conversations, they say, well, what, are you going to just make a lost generation? Where, you guys, sorry about that, you're going to die of hypertension and everything, but your kids will take good care of them. It's not the case. The idea is to find ways to mitigate for the individuals who have undergone these adverse childhood events, but also sort of break that cycle from perpetuating it to your kids. And so one of the things that we did was we looked at a bunch of studies because, we're academics and we have free access to the library. That's the main reason. And it was interesting because one of the things we talked about today was the idea of linear responses to complex problems. And these are complex problems. And the idea of using systems to address problems within systems. So a lot of the studies are still very, very linear. They're like, we did this intervention, this is what happened 4 months later. Is that really going to be the horizons that's going to provide us the information we need to know? But often it's a good start. It's a start. But looking at this, one of the big things, like I said, is try to prevent the bottom of the pyramid and try to mitigate as much as possible the second layer. Because if we can stop things there, we can prevent the sequela. That's sort of the goal. So the areas that we found that had really good information visiting nurses. Visiting nurses programs, which come in a lot of different titles, a lot of different names. Basically, the bottom line for most of the visiting nurse impact that works is the first 2 years of a child's life, there's a nurse that's consistently involved with helping with parenting, helping learning about feeding, helping learning about coping, and for 2 years, there's someone who is basically an addition to the family, whose job is to help that child's transition, and the family's transitioned with that child. The visiting nurses data has had some of the best results on reducing the child abuse and neglect, mother not returning to more reproduction as quickly, smoking, prenatal smoking exposure going down. And basically, the idea is if you get engaged, if you get and engage the parents this early, they're involved in the time when the kids are most neurally vulnerable. When my son's 10 now, and he says it's okay for me to talk about him. I have to get his approval now that he's 10. But one of the things I realized when he was young, I had to read to him. It wasn't that I was like forced to, but I realized that if I just talked to him, all I would say is, I love you, I love you, I love you. And his vocabulary would be for shit. But he'd be like a little Buddha, and that'd be okay. But one of the reasons we read was so that the things that came out of my mouth wouldn't just be very, monosyllabic and very caring. But when you're looking at situations where people are socially stressed, you'll see kids who in lower socioeconomic levels, the vocabulary of a 5-year-old will not be the equivalent of vocabulary of a middle-class 5-year-old. And a lot of it's the engagement. I mean, think about when you're at the store. Let's pretend you're at Whole Foods. If that ever happens, it happens. And you see like a 4-year-old at Whole Foods is walking along. And she said something about, sparkling water. And the mom would be like, so where do you think sparkling water comes from? And, and what's the CO2? Blah, blah, blah. They engage their child with learning constantly. If your life is very chaotic and very stressed, and you're at this grocery store, what do you want your kid to do? Yeah, shut up, be quiet, be still. I don't have time for this, we need to get stuff done. That has sequela. That has long-term sequela. So if you can create an environment where there's some support and there's some relational support with the family, with the mother, in caring for and growing this child, it has academic results. For taking care of these kids for like 2 years. Just being a visiting drop-in nurse, which is a very important thing. One of the other areas they found that had a very good, we talked about, the initial one was about sort of prevention. The second one is mitigation. For kids who are exposed to families that have a high level of ACEs or potential high level of ACEs, early childhood education, getting them into a structured environment where they basically have wraparound services. Things like early Head Start and Head Start. It confuses me how for decades if you just stick with the money, the investment on putting money into early childhood education versus the long-term spending that we have for someone whose life is out of control and chaotic. This is one of when we're talking about these areas, and we started with the word advocacy, it's like these things work. We're family physicians, we're social workers. We know these things work. We need to talk to the people who are actually the stakeholders who make the decisions, because we've been trying to get early childhood education fully funded for decades. But now we have really good evidence that not only is it affecting us here and now, it's going to affect our Medicare costs. I mean, think about the fact, what if we had that? I really need that time machine, because that's, I think, what we figured out this morning is all we need is a time machine. Go back and there's like no redlining and get rid of racism, and then everything's good right now. But this is sort of like a time machine thing. We know that there are children that as they grow older are going to be sicker if they live in situations where they're exposed to these things. So we need the prevention, we need the mitigation. Things like the nursing visiting and the early childhood interventions have the best data that we've seen. Yeah. So, best evidence for decreasing the impact and preventing ACEs, and routinely showing up in things like state legislatures. When I first came to Minnesota, which is not here, it's more over there, I suppose. There were two things that were up for debate in the state legislature. And one of them was early childhood education, and the other was a stadium. Yeah, we know how that went. Okay. But it's just like, you think of the idea, it's like if they put the money in 10 years ago, it's like, where would we be now? And it's one of the biggest things I ran into is the idea about equity versus equality. When we talk about equity, we're looking at putting resources where they're needed. And when we talk about equality, it talks about things like universal early childhood education. Honestly, we don't necessarily need that. I mean, if that's what it takes to get it funded, then yeah, let's do it. But our governor was going for very much targeted to the kids who are at greatest risk and would have the greatest benefit. And that's one of the places we run into when we're looking at equity versus equality. I love this story. I love stories. This is what I was talking to John about why I don't lecture while drinking, because this would be a long lecture. So I remember Bush Foundation, the executive vice president at the time, she came and was talking to a bunch of folks. And it's a really great foundation. They do a lot of really good work. And she was telling stories about, and she said, yeah, well, from a funder's perspective, they're looking for outcomes that they can then go and present to their board and say, this is what we've done. And she's like, technically, from a funding perspective, Sesame Street was a failure. And whenever anyone hears that, they just get all tough. They're like, Big Bird, what do you mean Sesame Street was a failure? Well, the initial idea behind Sesame Street was to decrease the gap in kindergarten preparedness from low-income kids to kids that had more moderate and normal incomes. And so they had, I remember learning how to count to 20, 20, in Spanish. It was very big. All my friends being like, snuffleupagus, all these things. I mean, I won't get into the details, but it was a very important part of our childhood. And you know what it did? It raised the level of preparedness for those low-income kids. But you know what it also did? It raised the level for the non-low-income kids. Gap's still there. Sesame Street's a failure. You see how it works? Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why I don't like funding so much. But anyway, we won't get into that. So now we know very clearly that it helps. It helps mitigate a lot of social factors. It helps prepare kids. It's when you talk about when you have a kid and you know about the first 3 years, you get all stressed. You're like, oh my God, did I say something wrong? Is this the thing that's going to put him over the top? But my kid, I'm going to do a little bragging because I can. I have the microphone. We were driving through. We live right next to the neighborhood that we serve, and we were driving through, and he was, I want to say, 4. And it was myself and my wife at the time, and we were in the front seat, and Amos's in the back, and he always reads all the signs. He's like, and so he's 4, and we drive by a sign, and it says, plant a, he reads in his little boy voice, plant a seed and watch it grow. I'm not sure I understand the enormity of that. And we were like, okay, did that just happen? That was a thing. Yeah, so that's Amos. I'll bring him next time. He's great. So you're in that situation where when you have your own child, you're concerned enough about. But now we have the responsibility to our population that we serve, our communities that we serve, and we have a voice that they don't have. I always joke, I'm a black, lesbian, Buddhist. I'm not left-handed, but I have a lot of places where I'm not necessarily privileged, but I am a family physician. And when I show up in the Capitol at St. Paul and I'm talking about policies, people know that my vested interest is my patients and my community. It's not my fancy laser that I want to get paid for or something like that. It's the people of the community. So it's our responsibility to use that privilege appropriately, because the people I take care of do not have a voice. They have my voice. And it's pretty loud. So I am a big fan of this because everyone looks at all of the challenges we have. I like to use challenges also because, it gives us some hope. They seem like they're problems, but they're actually challenges or opportunities or chopportunities, if you must. But when I look at the challenges that we face, and as we were talking about earlier, one of the big curses people always, they attribute it to the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. You can't get more interested than the times we live in right now. These are very, very interesting times. And it can feel very overwhelming. So my big motto is, Arthur Ashe was one of my heroes when I was growing up. It was Arthur Ashe, Muhammad Ali, and they were just the best. I love them. And we would say, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And I think that that's critical because where we need to be is like right here, right now. We need to make the choices that make the next step more reasonable. The next step is not going to be the one that solves it all, but it's going to be important that we take that next step. So start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And I really believe in advocating at every level. One of the things that we're trying to do at the University of Minnesota is increase our students of color. I was telling, we had a visit from the AAMC Diversity Muckety-Muck. I'm sure it's a much different title than that. But it was a couple years ago. And one of the things at our clinic is they are like hard and fast rules. You need 90 days to cancel a clinic. And so I get this email, like, the AAMC Diversity Muckety-Muck is coming next Thursday. We need you to be there. I was like, I'd love to, but I have a clinic, can't cancel clinic. Boom, shoot off the email, and I'm like, that's done. Like 4 hours later, we've canceled your clinic. We need you to be there. And I was like, what is going on? I was like, we don't have enough brown people. I mean, they sent out a call to arms for all the brown in, Hennepin County, and we still only occupied half of the auditorium. But they've taken it to heart, and they really, really, really want to increase both the undergrad medical school presence and the residency presence. And one of the programs we started it's called the Bachelor's MD program. The idea is that you find some really high capacity, bright high school students who get admitted to the U, and then you guide them along, and they get accepted into the medical school, and so they do the entire thing in 7 years. It's a 7-year program, and our first cohort started last year. And it was really interesting because myself and Dr. Slattengren trained and manufactured at University of Wisconsin. We always joke that he's my white shadow because like everything I do, he's like 3 years behind, and like we go everywhere together. Which is handy because I have short arms and he's reachable. He could get everything, you know. So we started, we were the physicians that did the seminar, which is, sort of what's being a doctor, what are the challenges, teaching about leadership and social justice and health disparities and inequities and all this kind of stuff. And as the year went by, we just did our class every Monday afternoon. As the year went by, you could see just from what was going on in our class who was struggling and the lots of different reasons that they were struggling. And so we got the GPAs at the end, and, well, there was some review, let's just say. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, oh, wait, what does this remind me of? This. And so I wrote a letter, and I ask you to bear with me because I don't have it memorized. And this letter's from me to a lot of the decision makers. I said, "Dear all, I thought it would be important to share a little bit of my student career history." Where is she? Who's the one that likes the career biographies? There you go. Start writing this down. Thought it would be important to share a little bit of my student history career. To begin, nothing in here is about bragging. It's really about giving a story that may strike some similarities to those you have seen. When I was in high school, I went to a very high-performing public school We had 13 National Merit Scholars in the year I graduated. I was one of them, except at the time in 1985, my award was called the National Merit Outstanding Negro Scholar Award. Yes, this was in 1985, and that's exactly what they called it. Anyway, I mention this because it's an indication of the fact that I would have been considered a very high-capacity, high-potential performer in college. For many reasons that I won't go into, there was no family support for me either financially or socially to go and enter college. I found a way to get to college by myself. Eventually decided to stay in the town that I grew up in and go to the University of Oklahoma. And in order to afford to eat and buy books, I had to work night shifts at Hardee's. I was in the drive-thru because my manager thought I was smart. I would work nights and close the Hardee's quite late. I didn't have a car, so if my friend couldn't pick me up, I would have to walk back to campus. I worked multiple nights each week and carried a full credit load. I would say my grades were mediocre at best. By the end of the first semester, it was clear to me that I was very bored staying in the same town that I grew up in. I went to a large pile of brochures that had been sent to me after winning the National Merit Outstanding Negro Scholar Award. And I chose Boston University to apply to because it had rolling admissions. And it would accept me on my ACT scores and SAT scores alone, as my GPA was not very impressive. I ended the year with probably about a 3.2. As a result of my ACT and SAT scores, Boston University offered me a very significant scholarship in my first year. I still had to work city obligations, but I had more time for my education, and I did much better. My second year, financial offer was cut significantly, and I had to work in order to continue to stay in school. At that point, my grades began to drop. At the beginning of the third year, I was unable to meet the financial obligations that would have allowed me to stay in school at Boston University. I dropped out, I got a job, and continued to go to classes. There were times when I'd take a test and write on it to the professor, "I'm not enrolled in this class, but I am enjoying learning from you." I was a live-in nanny. I worked and went to some classes, and I finally got a job at Fenway Community Health Center in Boston as a phlebotomist. My friends all graduated in 1989. I had a good job. I was in healthcare, and I enjoyed the people I got to work with. Fenway Community Center at that time was one of the only places in New England, and this is in the late 80s, that had HIV patients and they could get treatment. I worked there at a time when only AZT was available for treatment. I saw a lot of people die that I couldn't help, and I decided I needed to go back to school and finish my degree and become a doctor. There's a fascinating story about how I got into UC Santa Cruz, but I will tell you that another time. To bring this story to a quicker end, I'll get to the point. I had significant financial support from the University of California, Santa Cruz. I was able to bring my grades up to the point where I applied for an NIH scholarship. I was accepted and became an NIH Minority Biomedical Scholar, MBRS. As a result, I had pretty much a full ride, and I was able to finish off my bachelor's degree. Every year there, my grades improved as my scholarship funding and social support became more robust. By the end of my time at UC Santa Cruz, I received the second highest grade in my biology exit exam, and as a result, graduated with honors. I entered medical school the following academic year. I had a full funding as a result of loans and scholarships, and proceeded to make the best grades of my life. I graduated with honors and got into the residency of my first choice. Nothing personal, UW, I didn't know about you. I got the residency of my first choice and was immediately hired as faculty with a joint appointment in the Department of Family Medicine and Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Since then, I've had an incredibly distinguished career with multiple awards and leadership positions. As I said above, this is not about to brag about who I am, but it's to tell you the story about who I was and how I got to be who I am. People invested in me, and it paid back in dividends. This is all to say, it's not just about the money for a lot of students, but for some people it is. It's not just about the social support for a lot of students, but for some students it is. And for some people, it's both. I believe that we need to cone down on the social determinants of successfully turning someone who matriculates into someone who graduates. This is a worthwhile investment. I wanted you to know this story because I don't know which one of those kids in that class is me. But I know they're in there, and they deserve a chance. Feel free to share the story with anyone you want. Feel free to ask me questions. I just thought you should know. I bring this up because one of the things that is very clear is that advocacy in medicine is at a lot of different levels. It's not just sitting in the State House or in the Capitol. It's about being an advocate for our students and our learners at every level. Because we have more impact there than anywhere. And it's something that we have to remember. So I hope that wasn't too long. Okay, also this. Start where you are, do what you can, use what you got. So this is one of my favorite research findings. And I got to tell you, in my own life, I think this was very true, suggesting that even just one safe relationship early in life can give you a much better chance of growing up healthy and mitigating a lot of those ACEs. I had a big sister when I was, must have been like 11, and she would come every month and we'd go to like pizza. I hated pizza, but I loved hanging out with her. And I remember one time I wasn't feeling that good, but I still wanted to go because she was someone that would listen to me and she would just care about what was going on in my life. And when we talked about those kids who were neglected, I think I was probably very much along the line of some of the issues that I had to deal with. I remember coming out of the bathroom, we were at Pizza Hut or something, and I came out and I sat down at the table and I noticed that she had some friends with her. And I was like, hi. And I started talking and they all looked at me like I was insane. And then I felt this little hand on my shoulder. And I looked up and it was her. She had a twin sister that I didn't know about. And they both went to Hardee's at Pizza at the same time. So anyway, long story short, having adults in your life who care about your life is a critical part of mitigating these things. And that's one of the reasons we started an organization called The Ladder. And The Ladder is it's a mentoring group for youth who are interested in healthcare careers who come from low wealth communities. We started at 4 years old, and that would be deep. We started in 4th grade and go all the way up to level 50. I'm usually the oldest one there. And we have everything in between. Middle school, high school, undergrad, medical school, residents, community docs, faculty, nurses, pharmacists. We have a cadre of people that are very invested in mentoring each other. And our motto is lift as you climb, build as you grow. We meet once a month, every second Saturday of the month. We have eating groups where you sit down and you talk about, we do our introduction, you know, those icebreakers that everyone loves? Ours are cool. So we put up 2 quotes on the board, like one might be, you know, fall down 7 times, get up 8. One might be, you know, you have 2 hands, one's for helping yourself, the other's for helping someone else. And we have a conversation. You introduce yourself. You say, I'm medical scholar Renee. I teach at the medical school. I'm going to choose fall down 7 times, get up 8. Because when I was your age, I had to go to 3 different colleges before I graduated. And now I teach at one of the best medical schools in the world. Also, UW is very good. But I get to tell that to those kids. And we share our stories, and we eat. And then we break up and we have hands-on learning and fun stuff. And then we get together at the end and we do our pledge. I want to, so this is one of the things that we try to do, is build a community of purpose.
We believe our true self is wise and compassionate and seek to know the self. We take full responsibility for our choices. We take full responsibility for our actions. We strive each day to appreciate the good in ourselves, our community, and our lives. We are determined to correct any mistake that we may have made and determined to take the right action now and in the future. We embrace the truth that each day we can be the right person and do the right thing starting now. We seek to see the best parts of others and speak directly to that being. We seek to see the good in our communities. We seek to serve the positive works in our communities. We seek knowledge and desire to act with our wisdom. We will spread by our actions and our lives the principles of a successful community. Lift as you climb, build as you grow. We know we will succeed because we will never give up. This I pledge.
That is The Ladder. And one of the reasons we built it was exactly because having that mentor is something we all need. And we all need it at every single level. And basically our motto is lift as you climb, build as you grow. And there's no one that can't help. And the funny thing about it is we always talk about how, I don't know how it happened that we built an organization to mentor youth, and it started becoming a wellness process for all the physicians in the community. I have residents who are like, you know, the ladder for me, it's like going to the gym. I'm like, I don't want to go, and then I go, and I feel so good. I was like, yeah, no, I understand exactly what you're talking about. And one of the things that we don't track a lot of things. We track a couple of things. One of the things we track is repeat suspensions. And it's interesting because our kids that work in our organization, we don't have good data on repeat suspensions. It's because none of our kids have been suspended. One of the things we track is medical students matching in family medicine residency. And University of Minnesota has made more family medicine doctors than any other university in the entire world. UW is also very good. But in that typical graduation population, it's anywhere from 19 to 21% of the population will match in family medicine residency. Of the kids that come to the ladder, it's 44%. It's not like we're making them family medicine doctors, but I think we're preserving their family medicine doctorness, because they come in wanting to be that person, and they get to have that kind of reassurance that we actually do something. We're in the community, we're doing work, we're doing that, we have the purpose that you're looking for. So 21% for the whole school, 44% for the folks that go work with us at the ladder. Just gotta make sure I hit all the points, it's very important. Okay, so the video. Okay, so why we must advocate. When you looked at the Farley Institute, Justice, Peace, Sustainability, what was very clear, and what I believe the Farleys truly understood, is that the foremost is justice. Because without justice, you can't have any of the others. And when you look at healthcare and health inequities, to paraphrase, health is not the absence of illness, it's the presence of justice. And as people who care about both our patients and communities, we have to be the ones that stand up and say that. And we have to be the ones that stand up and can tell the stories that the stakeholders can hear so that they can make the right decisions. Anytime you start with a poem, you should end with a poem. I'm always teaching. Okay, first, we're gonna, this is how meta we're gonna be. We're gonna go to MLK quoting Victor Hugo. And then people are like, well, why don't you just do Victor Hugo? I was like, well, there's stuff after is from MLK. So, if the soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness. The policymakers, and now we're to MLK, the policymakers of white society have caused the darkness. They've created discrimination, they've created slums, they've perpetuated unemployment, ignorance, and poverty. It is incontestable and deplorable that Negroes have committed crimes, but they are derivative crimes. They are born of greater crimes of the white society. When we look at things like, do I have some time? Do I have a little time? Okay. So when we look at things like, I don't know if you guys have run into this, but the conversation where you're talking about violence and, police committing violence on people, and then you're like, what about the black people killing the black people? That's black on black crime. It's like, I don't know if there's like some sort of seminar people go to, but it's a very consistent thread. And so I am not a fan of gun violence, and have just been appalled by our response to things. I mean, 8 people died of Tylenol poisoning back in the 70s, and I have to use a hammer to get into vitamin C nowadays. So one of the things I want people to understand is the system's not working for anybody. And that's one of the things that we need to be really clear about. One of the big health inequities is suicide. So, this is 538, and all the dots represent all suicides. And the 15,852 gun deaths are exclusively white men. How many people died in 9/11? A little over 3,000? It's like 5 9/11s every year. The most dangerous person to a white man with a gun is himself. But they're the first person to join up and say, no, black on black crime. So this is black homicide, which is not good. It's 6,000, so it's only 2 9/11s. I would put to you that these have the same root. There's a lot of people, it's interesting because suicide, they're like, oh, that's a mental health problem. How is this not a mental health problem? Who in their right mind wants to kill another person? How is this not a mental health problem? And I would go even further and say, it's not even a mental health problem, the suicides. The fact is, what we have, and we talked about complexities today, is suicide and homicide is an emergent property of despair and hopelessness. So we're not going to solve this with Prozac. We're going to solve this by creating a system where people feel valued, where they feel hopeful and powerful. And that means changing the policies that we currently have. So, as I said, it really, to me, when I look at it, all I see is hopelessness. And one of my favorite poems about hopelessness, join in if you know it. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore, then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Or maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? This is hopelessness. This is disenfranchisement. This is powerlessness. Dare I say impotence, but in all the ways that we actually mean it. So, I always like to end with a little hope, because this is the thing. I really believe one thing that's clear. There is no problem that human society faces that human society can't fix. And the number one thing that needs to happen is decision and conviction. And the only thing that evil needs to triumph is what? For good men to do nothing. So why are we going to be advocates? Because we don't want to live in a society that is this hopeless. We don't want our children to have to deal with this. Was Thomas Paine said, let us engage with this battle so that my children don't have to do it. Let us do this now. So, and I honestly believe we've solved problems before. That's the funniest thing. When I was working at Fenway as a phlebotomist, one of the doctors there, she was a woman who was a doctor in the South and then came up. I was like, well, and I grew up in Oklahoma where the party line was government's never fixed anything. I said, well, Dr. Blackburn, government's never fixed anything. She's like, Renee, sit down. And she went through, infectious disease from the 40s and 50s. She went through, at the time, perinatal mortality. She went through the Great Society and how when we had FQHCs that had wraparound services, it actually worked. And how what's happened is we've picked apart the things that actually worked, and we've demonized them because, they're just money sinks. It's like, no, we've done stuff that's worked, and we need to remember that those things are possible again. So, yep. The Farleys. One of the things I really appreciate about them is they saw the problems and they did something about them. And so when I think of this following poem, this is Walt Whitman. Boy, if anyone loved America, this guy. I just sort of picture him walking all around going, I love you, democracy, everything's amazing. And I was like, Walt, you do realize there were slaves around when this was going on. He's like, no, but democracy! But one of the things he does get right is this particular poem. And I want you to take it to heart, because this is what I want to insert into your being. Here, take this gift. I was reserving it for some hero, speaker, or general, one who should serve the good old cause, the great idea, the progress and freedom of the human race, some brave confronter of despots, some daring rebel. But I see what I was reserving belongs to you as much as to any. So, let's do this. Thank you.